That's not a real permit. Trash it." Officer Glenn Prescott snatched the laminated document from Raymond Kowalski's hand and held it up to the midday sun like it was a counterfeit bill. His short-sleeved navy uniform tight across his chest, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, so the lunch crowd could see every trace of contempt on his face. Behind him, 2 patrol cars sat angled across the sidewalk, lights still spinning, while 40 customers holding paper plates of brisket stood frozen in the bright overhead glare of a Tuesday afternoon. Prescott dropped the permit onto the asphalt without looking down. "Eyesore run by people who don't belong here," he said, loud enough for the phones already filming to catch every word. Raymond stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, both hands open at his sides, the kind of stillness that isn't weakness, the kind you only learn in places most people never survive. His black apron read Kowalski's BBQ across the chest, his white chef's tee and dark cargo pants pressed clean. He said nothing, because 30 minutes from now, Prescott's radio was going to say something that would end his career before the tow truck even arrived. And Raymond already knew it was coming. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. It was 12 minutes past noon on a Tuesday in Harlow, Georgia, and the intersection of Caulfield Avenue and 2nd Street smelled the way heaven probably should. The smoke from the oak wood in Raymond Kowalski's trailer smoker had been rolling since 5 in the morning, low and slow, the way his grandmother's neighbor used to do it before anyone in this town cared about the difference between good barbecue and great barbecue. The brisket had been on for 7 hours. The pulled pork was already sold out. The line that had wrapped the corner of the block 45 minutes ago had dissolved into a loose crowd of regulars perched on the low brick wall of the old insurance building next door, eating off paper plates balanced on their knees, laughing with their mouths full, taking pictures of their sandwiches before they took a single bite. This was Tuesday in Harlow. This was what 40 people had rearranged their lunch hours for. This was what Raymond Kowalski had built with his own 2 hands and every dollar he had left after 3 combat tours. Devon Park was working the window in a gray short-sleeve Henley and dark jeans, moving fast the way 20-year-olds move when they actually care about the job, handing out napkins in fistfuls, calling out order numbers, grinning at the regulars who didn't even need to say their names anymore. Devon had the kind of energy that made a 10-minute wait feel like 5. Raymond had hired him for exactly that reason, and for a few other reasons he had never explained out loud. Bridget Calloway was sitting on the brick wall 14 feet from the service window, a brisket sandwich in one hand and her phone in the other, wearing a pale yellow blouse tucked into dark wide-leg trousers, doing what journalists do on their lunch break, which is never actually stop being journalists. She had been coming to Kowalski's BBQ every Tuesday for 6 weeks. She had been meaning to pitch a feature on Raymond for 3 of those weeks. She had not yet gotten around to it. Nobody was ready for what pulled up. At 12:12 p.m., the 2 patrol cars came in from the north end of Caulfield. No sirens, just the lights, which was somehow worse. A deliberate entrance, the kind that says, "I chose to do this slowly." Prescott stepped out of the lead car first. He was a tall man, wide across the shoulders, the short-sleeved navy uniform doing very little to hide the fact that he had built his physical presence as carefully as he had built his reputation. He wore his sunglasses up on his forehead the way some men wear a badge, not for function, but as a statement. His partner, a younger officer whose face went uncertain the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk and read the crowd, hung back near the second car. 2 more officers climbed out behind him and took positions that felt rehearsed, a formation that said this had been planned before they left the precinct. Raymond was at the window taking an order when he registered the lights in his peripheral vision. He finished writing the order on his pad. He handed it back to Devon. He wiped his hands on the front of his apron, black apron, white letters, Kowalski's BBQ, and stepped down from the truck to meet whatever was walking toward him, because in Raymond Kowalski's experience, walking toward the thing was always better than letting it come to you. Prescott didn't waste time. He moved through the edge of the lunch crowd, the way people move when they want the crowd to notice them moving, and he stopped 4 feet from Raymond and looked him up and down once, slowly, the way a man looks at something he has already decided the value of. "Your permit," Prescott said. "Let me see your operating permit." Raymond reached into the front pocket of his dark cargo pants and produced the laminated card he had been carrying every operating day for 14 months. He held it out. Prescott took it the way people take things they intend to inspect rather than receive. 2 fingers, arm extended, and then he lifted it toward the overhead noon sun that was pouring straight down onto Caulfield Avenue, with the particular ferocity of a Georgia July. No shadows anywhere, everything exposed. The 40 customers had gone quiet. The brick wall crowd stopped eating. 2 people who had been walking past on the far sidewalk slowed down and stopped. The sound of the city filled the silence. A distant car horn, the lazy roll of the smoker, the faint creak of the tow truck that was idling half a block down the street, which nobody had noticed until right now. Prescott held the permit up for a long time, longer than it would take to read it, long enough for everyone watching to understand that the reading was not the point. Then he dropped it. He didn't throw it. He didn't hand it back. He opened his 2 fingers and let it fall from chest height, and it hit the asphalt face down. And the sound it made was very small, but every person on that sidewalk heard it. Raymond did not look down at it. He kept his eyes on Prescott. His hands, which had come up slightly when the permit fell, settled back open at his sides, palms forward, a posture that anyone who had ever served would recognize immediately. Controlled, deliberate, communicating nothing that could be used against him. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was loose, his eyes were steady and dark and completely unreadable. And somewhere behind them something was calculating with a precision that had nothing to do with anger. "Permit's fraudulent," Prescott said, and his voice had risen just enough to carry. "This whole setup is fraudulent. You're operating without authorization on a city easement, and I'm shutting this down." Raymond said, "That permit is valid. It was issued by the city planning office 14 months ago. The authorization number is on the front." Prescott smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that tells you the person wearing it has decided the conversation is already over. "That's what they all say," Prescott said. And then he turned, not to his partner, not to the other officers, but to the crowd. He turned to the crowd the way a man turns to an audience, because that was what this was. That was what it had been from the moment the patrol cars rolled in with the lights on and no sirens. A performance staged for maximum visibility on the busiest block in downtown Harlow at the height of the Tuesday lunch hour. "This truck," Prescott said, loud and easy, like he was making an announcement at a community meeting, "is an eyesore, run by people who don't belong here." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel it pressing against the buildings. Devon Park was 19 years old, and he had worked for Raymond Kowalski for 4 months, and he had heard stories from his uncle about moments exactly like this one. His hands were already moving before his brain had finished the sentence. He pulled his phone from the back pocket of his dark jeans, opened the camera, switched to live, and pressed go. He angled it toward Prescott without making a production of it, his gray Henley sleeve resting on the edge of the service window, steady as a tripod. The overhead noon light falling clean and full across the entire scene. 2 viewers joined the stream, then 8, then 23. Bridget Calloway had put down her brisket sandwich. She was already reaching into the canvas bag beside her on the brick wall, the one that always carried her press badge and the compact voice recorder she kept clipped to the inside pocket out of habit. She pulled the badge lanyard over her head and let it hang against her yellow blouse. And she did not take out the recorder because she did not need it. The phone in her hand was already recording, and the professional instinct that had been dormant for 6 minutes of lunch was now running at full capacity. She noted the badge number on Prescott's uniform. She noted the positions of all 4 officers. She noted the time. Prescott was still talking. He was telling a woman in the crowd that she should move along. This was a police matter. And the woman was not moving. And 3 people who had been mid-bite were now holding their sandwiches forgotten in their hands, watching with expressions that had moved well past surprise into something slower and colder. Raymond Kowalski had not moved. He was watching Prescott with those same steady, unreadable eyes, and inside the quiet that he had built around himself like a second skin over years of standing in places where panic was a liability and stillness was survival, a single thought moved through him with the unhurried certainty of a fact rather than a hope. He already called this in, Raymond thought. He came here with paperwork ready. He thinks the permit is going to come back dead in the system. He has no idea what's attached to my name. Raymond had never told anyone in Harlow about the Pentagon program. Not Walter, not Devon, not even his mother, who would have told every person at her church by Sunday morning out of pure, uncomplicated pride. He had been selected 6 months ago, told the documentary crew would be in touch, nodded at the program coordinator, and then driven his truck to the corner of Caulfield and 2nd Street the next morning and opened the window at 10 o'clock like he did every day. The selection had felt like something that happened to someone else, something that existed in a different register from the real work of the brisket and the permits and the quarterly tax filings. He had not thought about it this morning when he loaded the smoker. He had not thought about it when Devon showed up 15 minutes early with coffee, the way he always did. He was thinking about it now. Prescott had called for the tow truck. It was moving up Caulfield from the half-block holding position, diesel engine loud in the noon air, and the crowd on the brick wall had stood up now, all of them, paper plates still in hand, because nobody was leaving. Not a single person had walked away. They were standing in the bright overhead light of a Harlow Tuesday with their phones up and their eyes fixed on a man in a white chef's tee and a black apron who had not raised his voice and had not raised his hands and had not given Officer Glenn Prescott a single thing he could use. Prescott said, "Turn around, hands behind your back." Raymond Kowalski looked at him for one long moment. Then he turned around. He placed his hands behind his back, and the cuffs clicked onto his wrists on a Tuesday sidewalk in Harlow, Georgia, in front of 40 witnesses and one live stream that was now reading 4,000 concurrent viewers, while the tow truck backed toward everything he had built, and the smoker rolled its slow oak wood smoke into the Georgia sky, and Bridget Calloway pressed record, and Devon Park did not look away from the screen. Raymond closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them, and he waited. Before we go back to that sidewalk, before we talk about what Officer Glenn Prescott set in motion on a Tuesday afternoon in Harlow, Georgia, you need to understand exactly what he put his hands on, because the truck wasn't just a truck. The permit wasn't just a permit. And Raymond Kowalski, standing there in his white chef's tee and black apron, with his hands open and his face carved from something harder than patience, was not just a man selling brisket. To understand what Raymond Kowalski built, you have to go back to a road outside Kandahar province, Afghanistan, on a morning in October that smelled like dust and diesel and cold mountain air coming down off the hills. Raymond was 26 years old, a staff sergeant on his 2nd combat tour, riding 3rd vehicle in a 4-truck patrol convoy. The overhead sun was sharp and white. The road stretched flat between 2 ridgelines, and then the world disappeared. The IED detonated under the 2nd vehicle. Raymond's truck was close enough that the pressure wave cracked his window and filled the cab with smoke and ringing silence. He was out of the vehicle before the order came, moving toward the burning truck, pulling Private First Class Alejandro Reyes out through a shattered doorframe, then going back in for Corporal Dex Mitchell, whose leg was destroyed below the knee, dragging him 40 meters through open ground while the hillside opened up with small arms fire. Raymond Kowalski lay flat on top of Dex Mitchell for 38 minutes while the engagement played out around them, using his own body as armor, never moving. When the firing stopped, both men were alive. Specialist Tyrese Bowman and Sergeant Kwame Sai did not make it out of the second vehicle. Raymond had trained with both of them. He knew that Tyrese was saving money to buy his girlfriend a ring. He knew that Kwame had a 4-year-old daughter back in Columbus, Ohio, named Imani, who called him Daddy Kwame and drew him pictures of giraffes. Raymond carried those two names out of Afghanistan with him. He carries them still. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross 14 months later at a ceremony at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4-star general shook his hand in front of 200 people in a room with marble floors and overhead fluorescent lighting that made everything look polished and official and clean. Raymond stood in his dress uniform, army green jacket over matching trousers, his chest full of ribbons, and accepted the medal with a stillness that the general's aide later described to a colleague as the most composed thing he had ever seen in 30 years of military ceremonies. Raymond Kowalski said thank you. He meant it. But what he was thinking, standing in that marble room, was that no medal ever explained what a 4-year-old girl was supposed to do with it. He did a third tour, Iraq this time. He came back from that one quieter than the others. Not broken. Raymond Kowalski was structurally incapable of broken, but different, purposeful in a way that had no outlet yet, carrying invisible weight that he distributed across his shoulders like a ruck, so that no single person around him ever had to feel it. He came home to Harlow, Georgia in the spring. His mother, Darlene Kowalski, was standing on the porch of her house on Clement Street in a yellow blouse and dark slacks when the car pulled up. She didn't cry. She was a retired school teacher who had raised Raymond alone after his father left when Raymond was 9, and she had a retired school teacher's relationship with unnecessary displays of emotion. She simply held him for a long time in the overhead afternoon light, and that was enough. Raymond spent 3 weeks at home before the weight of purposelessness became intolerable. He sat at his mother's kitchen table every morning, and every morning she set a plate in front of him without asking, and every morning he stared out the window at the Harlow street he had grown up on and thought about the same question: what is this for now? The answer came sideways, the way the best answers do. He was at a gas station on Route 9 when he smelled smoke from a barbecue place 2 doors down, and something in his nervous system, something that had been calibrated for threat detection and survival for 11 years, registered it not as danger, but as home. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then he drove back to Darlene's house and told her he was going to open a food truck. Darlene said, quote, "All right." That was the entirety of her response. Because she had raised Raymond Kowalski, and she understood that when he decided something, the deciding was already done. He refused her money. She offered, and he refused, clearly and without guilt, because he needed the truck to be his, built from his hands and his service, and nothing borrowed. He used his VA business loan, which took 4 months to process and required more paperwork than clearing a forward operating base, and every dollar of his separation pay, and he bought a used 1999 Hallmark step-in trailer that had previously sold frozen custard at county fairs in rural Tennessee. He spent 11 weeks converting it. The brisket recipe took 18 months. That number sounds like an exaggeration. It is not. Raymond Kowalski approached the brisket the way he had approached every mission objective in his military career, with methodical precision and zero tolerance for acceptable but improvable results. He kept a notebook. He logged rub ratios, wood combinations, temperature curves, rest times, internal temperatures at hourly intervals. He fed batches to Darlene, to neighbors, to anyone who would give him an honest answer. Darlene's neighbor, Miss Pearline, an 81-year-old woman who had been cooking Georgia barbecue since before Raymond's parents were born, ate one bite of the final recipe and put her fork down and said, "Baby, you can sell that." Raymond considered that the most authoritative endorsement he had ever received, including from the United States Army. The city permit process was its own operation. Raymond appeared before the Harlow City Zoning Office 3 times, provided documentation of his VA business loan, his food handling certification, his liability insurance, his vehicle inspection records, and a detailed map of his intended service location on the corner of Callaway and 5th. The permit was reviewed and personally co-signed by Councilwoman Lena Vasquez, who had made veterans' economic integration one of the 4 pillars of her council platform. She signed it on a Wednesday morning and shook Raymond's hand and told him, "This city is lucky to have you in it." Raymond said thank you. He meant that too. He opened on a Monday in March, 18 months after the gas station parking lot. The line on that first day was 12 people. By the end of the first month, the Tuesday and Thursday lunch rushes were consistently 40 customers. Within 6 months, Kowalski's BBQ had a reputation that extended to every office building within a 4-block radius and a Yelp rating of 4.9 stars based on 241 reviews, the most recent of which read simply, "I drove 45 minutes for this brisket, and I have no regrets." Walter Pruitt started showing up on Thursdays about 3 months in. Walter had served with Raymond on the second tour, a sergeant first class with 22 years in, who had retired to Harlow because he had family there and because he didn't know where else to go after the Army was done with him. He would arrive at 9 a.m. in a gray Henley and dark jeans and simply ask Raymond what needed doing, and Raymond would tell him, and Walter would do it. Raymond offered to pay him. Walter refused, clearly and without guilt, because he needed the truck to need him. And Raymond understood that completely because he was the same kind of man. Devin Park came to the truck one afternoon looking for a job, and Raymond almost said no because he wasn't sure he needed the help. Then he watched Devin for 5 minutes, the way the kid stood straight without being told to, the way he listened to the whole sentence before responding, the way he looked Raymond in the eye without challenge or performance, just simple direct attention. Raymond thought about a 19-year-old with those qualities being handed a rifle instead of a spatula and felt something close to anger at the waste of it. He hired Devin that afternoon. Devin wore a red short-sleeve shirt and dark pants to work every day, kept his station cleaner than Raymond asked him to, and had the rare quality of knowing when to talk and when to simply work. The truck was never just a business. Raymond never said that out loud, because it would have embarrassed him. But every person who worked there, every customer who came back, every Thursday morning when Walter Pruitt showed up without being asked, all of it was connected to the same unspoken thing Raymond had been working out since he came home from that third tour. That the point was not survival. That the point was building something that required other people in order to function. That the point was Tyrese Bowman's grocery money, and Kwame Ose's daughter, and every young soldier who needed someone to show them that coming home was the beginning and not just the end of service. And then there was the thing Raymond had not told anyone in Harlow. 6 months before Officer Glenn Prescott rolled up with 2 patrol cars on a Tuesday afternoon, Raymond Kowalski received a certified letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of the Secretary, informing him that he had been selected as the inaugural featured entrepreneur of the Pentagon's Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative. The program was federally funded, operated under direct oversight of the VA Secretary's office, and designed to showcase veterans who had converted military discipline and leadership into civilian economic success. Raymond's selection had been reviewed and approved by a panel that included a Deputy Assistant Secretary, 2 active duty generals, and a senior staffer from the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. A DoD documentary crew was already in pre-production on a feature profile. Raymond Kowalski was the centerpiece of a federal program that was actively monitored by the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. His file, military record, distinguished service cross-citation, VA loan documentation, business registration, city permit, was sitting in a folder in the office of Colonel Simone Hartley, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary, who checked in on the initiative's progress every other week. Raymond had not told Darlene. He had not told Walter. He had not told Devon. He had told no one in Harlow, because the attention made him uncomfortable in a way he had no language for, because he had spent 11 years in a culture that treated individual recognition as something you accepted briefly and then moved past, and because the truck already meant what it meant to him and did not need a documentary crew to confirm it. So when Officer Glenn Prescott stepped out of his patrol car on that Tuesday, short-sleeved Navy uniform tied across the chest and sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead, like a man performing authority for an audience he'd already decided was beneath him, when he snatched the permit from Raymond's hand and held it up to the noon sun and then dropped it on the asphalt like it was nothing. He did all of that without knowing any of it, without knowing the IED or the marble room or the 18 months or the brisket or Tyrese or Kwame or Miss Pearline or Walter's Thursday mornings or Devon's clean station, without knowing the folder in Colonel Simone Hartley's office, without knowing that the man standing in front of him in a white chef's tee, black apron, and dark cargo pants, with his hands open and his face completely still, was not simply enduring what was happening. Raymond Kowalski was waiting, because he had learned something in 11 years that Glenn Prescott had apparently never been taught, that the most dangerous thing in any situation was not the man who was loud. It was the man who already knew how it ended. Nobody left. That was the first thing Officer Glenn Prescott noticed when the cuffs clicked shut and he straightened up and looked around at what he'd created. 40 people standing in the bright Tuesday noon light on Halcyon Street, paper plates forgotten in their hands, brisket going cold, every single one of them completely still. He had expected the crowd to scatter the way crowds usually did when authority made its presence known. That reflexive sidewalk shuffle, people suddenly remembering appointments, pretending they hadn't seen anything. That was what usually happened. That was what Prescott had counted on. Nobody moved. They stood in a wide, loose half-circle in the overhead midday sun. 40 men and women and 2 kids holding their mothers' hands, and every phone was up. Every single one. The light caught the screens like a row of small mirrors tilting toward him, and Prescott felt something shift in the air that he couldn't quite name. He pushed his sunglasses back up his nose and turned away from the crowd and toward his 2nd Patrol Unit, where Officer Dale Sims was standing by the hood, looking increasingly uncomfortable in his short-sleeved uniform, weight shifting from foot to foot. Raymond Kowalski sat down on the curb without being told to. He sat down slowly, deliberately, the way a man sits down when he has decided to sit down, not the way a man sits when his legs give out. His white chef's tee was bright under the noon sun. His black apron with the red script reading Kowalski's BBQ pooled slightly against his knees. His dark cargo pants had a smear of charcoal on the left thigh from the morning smoke prep. He looked at his truck. He looked at the tow operator who was idling at the corner, waiting for a signal. He looked at nothing particular. His expression was unreadable in the way that only certain kinds of training produce, not emptiness, but containment. A man holding something enormous in a very small space. 19-year-old Devon Park had drifted 4 steps to the left and had his phone up at chest height, filming without looking like he was filming, which was a skill he had developed over 3 years of working weekend events and which was now serving a purpose neither he nor anyone else had anticipated this morning when he'd put on his black jeans and his orange Kowalski's BBQ staff shirt and clocked in at 10:30. The number in the corner of his screen read 212 viewers. He didn't look at it. He kept his camera on Raymond Kowalski's face. Prescott was on his radio, and his voice had taken on a particular quality. Louder than necessary, the words clipped and certain, the tone of a man performing competence for an audience he was pretending not to acknowledge. He was calling in the permit number to his dispatcher, and everyone within 15 feet could hear him do it. Bridget Calloway heard every word. She had been a local news reporter for 11 years, and she had a very precise sense of when a story changed categories. She had walked into this lunch hour expecting nothing more than a good brisket sandwich, and had instead watched a man get handcuffed in broad daylight in front of 40 witnesses. She had already identified herself to the second officer as press, holding her credentials flat and steady, and the officer had looked at her badge and then at her face and then back at her badge and said nothing useful. Now she was standing at the edge of the crowd, phone and small recorder both running, and she was watching Prescott with the particular concentration of someone who is building a timeline in real time. She heard the permit number go over the radio. She wrote it down. The dispatcher's voice came back through the radio with the flat, professional neutrality of someone reading from a database. Bridget Calloway heard every syllable. The permit number was valid, current, issued by the Harlow City Planning Office 14 months ago. Co-signed on authorization by Councilwoman Lena Vasquez, Harlow City Council, 3rd District. The crowd heard it too. A woman near the back, middle-aged, wearing a yellow blouse and khaki slacks, still holding a paper plate, said quietly but clearly, "Valid." She said valid. Prescott's radio hand dropped slightly. He stood with his back to the crowd, and his shoulders were very still for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the math was simple and obvious and available to everyone present. 2 seconds in which the correct move, the only defensible move, was to make a single decision that would have been uncomfortable but survivable. He turned around. "Could be forged," he said. His voice was even, practiced. He looked at Raymond Kowalski on the curb, and he said it again, more firmly, directing it at his second officer rather than at anyone specific. "Permits can be forged. We hold the vehicle pending verification." 12 cameras caught it. Devon Park's viewer count hit 800. The woman in the yellow blouse made a sound in the back of her throat that was not quite a word. A man near the truck's serving window turned to the person beside him and said something low and flat. A kid, maybe 12 years old, looked up at his mother, and she put her hand on his shoulder without looking down. Her own phone held steady, her jaw set. Nobody left. It was 3 minutes after the cuffs went on when the silver Buick LeSabre came around the corner of Halcyon Street, going faster than its usual speed. It pulled into a spot 2 car lengths back from the truck, and the door opened, and Darlene Kowalski stepped out with a paper grocery bag in one arm and her phone in her other hand, and she took in the scene in approximately 4 seconds. The patrol cars, the tow truck idling at the corner, the crowd, the cuffs on her son's wrists, and something moved across her face that was not panic and was not anger and was not grief, but contained all 3 of them at once. She was 62 years old. She had taught 4th grade in Harlow for 31 years. She was wearing a light blue blouse tucked into pressed gray slacks, and she set her grocery bag down on the hood of her car with a precision that suggested she was already organizing herself from the inside out. She walked toward the scene. She did not run. She walked with the measured pace of a woman who understood that how you arrive determines what happens next. And she stopped at the edge of the police perimeter line where Officer Sims was standing, and she said, in a voice that was completely controlled and completely devastating, "My name is Darlene Kowalski. That is my son. I am requesting to speak with a supervisor." Sims blinked. "Ma'am, you need to stay." "I am standing still," Darlene said. "I am not approaching. I am identifying myself and requesting a supervisor. Those are both things I am legally entitled to do." Across the semicircle, Raymond Kowalski saw his mother. Something moved behind his eyes, not breaking, not even close to breaking, but something alive and very human that had not been visible in his face for the last 6 minutes. He looked at her, and he gave her the smallest, most deliberate nod. "I see you. I'm all right. Stay steady," she nodded back. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, exhaled a degree. Walter Pruitt had been standing near the back corner of the truck since the cuffs went on, and his stillness had been the stillness of a man doing active work to remain in place. He was in jeans and a gray t-shirt, forearms crossed, watching Prescott with a specific and practiced intensity. He was 51 years old and had served 22 years in the Army, and the thing he was feeling right now was something he recognized from a very particular category of situation, the one where the wrong action by a single person causes catastrophic consequences, and the only tool you have is discipline. He stepped forward. He didn't say anything. He simply stepped forward, and his posture said everything. Shoulders back, chin level, the body language of a man who is not afraid and who wants that understood. Prescott saw him and turned. "Sir, you need to step back." "That man," Walter said, and his voice was even and deliberate, "served 3 combat tours. You are sitting him on a curb like a— Step back, sir. Final warning." Walter's jaw tightened so visibly that 3 cameras zoomed in on it. His hands were open at his sides. His feet were planted. He was doing the calculation, and Prescott could see him doing it. And for one moment, neither of them moved. Then Walter Pruitt took 1 step back. Exactly 1. And he crossed his arms again and he stared at Prescott with the unflinching, absolute attention of a man who has decided that the most effective thing he can do right now is be seen watching. Devon Park's screen said 4,000 and climbing. Bridget Calloway had moved incrementally closer to the point where she could see Prescott's face clearly, and she kept her recorder running and her expression neutral. When Prescott glanced at her, she held up her press credentials again without speaking. His jaw shifted. He looked away first. She had covered City Hall for 6 years, and she knew what it looked like when an official realized he was in trouble and decided that the answer was more commitment rather than less. It was one of the most predictable and most destructive patterns in local government. She was watching it happen in real time on a Tuesday sidewalk in 72-degree weather. And she was also watching the tow operator at the corner check his phone. And she was watching Officer Sims, who had not moved or spoken in 4 minutes. And she was watching Raymond Kowalski standing at the perimeter line with the grocery bag still on the car hood and her hands folded in front of her. And she was watching Raymond Kowalski on the curb. Raymond had not spoken since the cuffs went on. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He was sitting in the full overhead noon sun with his back straight and his hands steady behind him and his eyes open, watching his truck, watching the tow operator, watching the crowd that had not moved. The crowd that had not moved. 40 people on a Tuesday sidewalk in Harlow, Georgia, who had come for lunch and who had stayed for something they were still in the process of understanding. They stood in the natural overhead midday light with their phones up and their plates cooling, and they did not leave because leaving would mean that this was something you could walk away from. And 40 people had independently and simultaneously decided that it was not. Devon Park's screen read 4,211, and somewhere in that number, in the way it kept climbing, in the way every phone was up, in the way Bridget Calloway was already composing her first sentence, in the way Raymond Kowalski was still standing at that line, still waiting for a supervisor, still completely composed. Somewhere in all of that was a mechanism that Glenn Prescott could not see and had not anticipated and could no longer stop. He didn't know that yet. He was still talking into his radio. He was still absolutely certain he was right. And Raymond Kowalski sat on the curb in the sunshine, and the crowd didn't move, and the cameras didn't lower, and the tow truck idled at the corner like a held breath. And everything that was about to happen was already in motion. The sidewalk concrete was warm through Raymond Kowalski's cargo pants. Not unpleasant, just present. The kind of detail your body notices when your mind decides there is nothing left to fight with your hands, so it finds other things to hold on to. The sun sat directly overhead in a wide, cloudless Georgia sky, pouring white natural light across the entire block, like a stage that hadn't asked anyone's permission to illuminate what was happening on it. Raymond Kowalski sat on the curb with his wrists behind his back, his white chef's tee and black apron still carrying the smell of 12 hours of brisket smoke. And he watched Officer Glenn Prescott pace the sidewalk like a man who had not yet realized the ground beneath him had already shifted. Prescott hadn't realized it yet. That was the thing. Raymond had known it the moment the dispatcher's voice came back through the radio confirming the permit number. Valid, current, city-issued, Councilwoman Vasquez's signature right there at the bottom. And Prescott had said the word forged anyway. That word, that specific word, chosen out loud in front of 40 people and 12 phones and one professional journalist who still had brisket sandwich wrapper in her left hand and press credentials in her right. Raymond Kowalski had heard men make fatal decisions before, in Kandahar, in the Karangal Valley, in the exact second before something irreversible began. He recognized the sound, and so he sat on the curb, wrists cuffed, and he waited, because waiting was something he had trained himself to do with absolute precision. 19 feet away, Devon Park was still live. The phone was in his right hand, arms slightly raised, steady as anything. And if you were watching the stream at that moment, which 41,200 people now were, you could see everything. The tow truck backing slowly into position behind the Kowalski's BBQ truck, its reverse alert beeping at a pace that felt almost lazy against the tension of the scene. You could see Prescott's second officer, a younger man who had stopped talking entirely and was now studying his own boots. You could see Darlene Kowalski standing 20 feet from her son, hands clasped in front of her gray cardigan and dark slacks, not moving, watching Prescott with an expression that had moved past devastation and arrived somewhere much quieter and much more dangerous. You could see Walter Pruitt on the far edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest, jaw working slowly, every muscle in his body doing the disciplined work of not moving forward. And you could see Raymond Kowalski on the curb, still present, as though the sidewalk were a patrol base and he was simply between operations. Devon's viewer count ticked, 41,000, then 44,000, then it jumped to 52,000 in under 90 seconds, and Devon, to his credit, said nothing. He just kept the frame steady and let the silence speak. 3 miles away, in the glass and brick offices of WHLW Channel 7, Bridget Calloway's desk phone rang once before her editor Marcus Webb picked it up. Bridget was standing on the sidewalk outside Kowalski's BBQ with her personal phone pressed to her ear, her press lanyard swinging against her green blouse and dark slacks. And she was not using her reporter voice. She was using the voice she only used when something was real. "Marcus, I need a crew here right now. Not in 20 minutes. Right now. I am on location, and I have been on location since before it started, and I have it all." Marcus asked her what she had. Bridget looked at Raymond Kowalski sitting on the curb, and then at Prescott pacing, and then at the 40 people who still had not moved a single foot toward their cars. "I have everything," she said. "Send the crew." 460 miles north, in a beige-carpeted office on the 4th floor of a federal building in Washington, D.C., a woman named Andrea Sims was eating a salad at her desk and scrolling her phone on her lunch break. Andrea Sims worked as a program coordinator in the VA Secretary's press office. She had spent the better part of last November helping process the paperwork for the Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative cohort, which meant she had read every file, every military record, every business summary that had crossed the desk. When the clip appeared in her social media feed, Devon Park's live stream, already clipped and titled and posted, she recognized the truck before she recognized the man. Kowalski's BBQ. Black lettering on a white panel. She put down her fork. She leaned forward. She watched for 11 seconds. Then she picked up her desk phone and called the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office direct line, which she had memorized because her job required it. And she said 4 words to the duty officer who answered, "Pull Raymond Kowalski's file." The duty officer's name was Specialist Marcus Trent, and he pulled the file in under 90 seconds because it was not buried. Raymond Kowalski was flagged, Distinguished Service Cross, 3 combat tours, federally designated Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative entrepreneur, with an active DoD documentary profile in production. Trent read the flag notations, looked at the clip Andrea had described, and immediately escalated to the only person in the building whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of collision between a federal program and a national news story in real time. Colonel Simone Hartley, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary, was in a briefing room down the hall when Trent knocked. She was wearing her Army service uniform, dark green jacket over a pressed white shirt, gold eagle insignia on her collar, and she had the kind of posture that did not change whether she was in a briefing or a crisis. Both looked the same to her. She read the file summary Trent handed her in 45 seconds, asked one clarifying question, "Is he currently in federal program status?" Received the answer yes, and then walked calmly back to her office and sat down at her desk and picked up her phone. She dialed the non-emergency line for the Harlow, Georgia Police Department. It was 12:34 p.m. Back on the sidewalk, Raymond Kowalski watched the tow truck driver climb out of his cab and begin attaching the hook to the front undercarriage of the BBQ truck. The driver was a heavy-set man in a gray work shirt who kept glancing back at the crowd and at the phones and at the general atmosphere of the scene, as though he had arrived at a job that was turning out to be a very different job than advertised. Raymond watched the hook make contact with the metal frame of his truck, the truck he had built, the truck that had taken 18 months and every dollar of his separation pay and a VA business loan he had paid down 11 months early, the truck where Devon Park had learned to operate a smoker and Walter Pruitt had relearned how to laugh on Thursday afternoons. Raymond Kowalski watched the metal hook touch the metal frame of the thing he had built from nothing, and he closed his eyes. 3 seconds. Exactly 3 seconds. It was the same 3 seconds he had taken before every patrol in Kandahar. Not prayer exactly, though it was not nothing either. It was the act of finding the floor beneath the floor. The part of yourself that was not afraid of what came next because it had already accepted all possible outcomes and chosen to move forward anyway. 3 seconds of pure interior silence. Raymond Kowalski had done this before IEDs, before ambushes, before the night in the Karengal Valley when 2 men in his squad did not come home, and he had stayed low and kept the others alive for 40 minutes under fire until the medevac reached them. 3 seconds was enough. It had always been enough. He opened his eyes. The tow truck driver was still working the hook. Prescott was on his phone now, turned slightly away from the crowd, one hand on his hip. The crowd had not moved. Darlene Kowalski was watching her son with an expression that had shifted again. She had seen him open and close his eyes, and she recognized something in it, and her hands were still clasped, but her chin had lifted slightly. Walter Pruitt, from his position at the edge of the crowd, was watching Raymond with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen that same gesture in a very different country and understood exactly what it meant. Devon's stream, 67,000 concurrent viewers. At Senator Clifford Marsh's office in the Hart Senate Office building, Communications Director Paula Renner had been on her phone since 12:31. She was a fast-moving woman in a navy blazer and dark slacks who had spent 11 years managing political communications and had developed a specific instinct for the exact moment when a story stopped being a story and became a moment. This was a moment. She texted the senator a single sentence and a link. The senator was in a subcommittee session. He read the text under the table, watched 30 seconds of the clip, and quietly excused himself into the hallway. He called Paula back in under 2 minutes. His voice was flat and direct. "Get me a statement drafted in 10 minutes. And find out what program office covers the Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative, because I want to be on record before anyone else is." Paula was already typing. At 12:36, Colonel Hartley reached someone at the Harlow PD main desk. At 12:37, she was transferred to the duty sergeant. At 12:38, the duty sergeant understood enough of what he was hearing to put Colonel Hartley on hold and walked directly to Captain Jerome Stafford's office with a knock that did not wait for an answer. Stafford was a broad-shouldered man in a long-sleeved dark uniform who had been in law enforcement for 22 years and who had the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough bad outcomes to develop a deep sensitivity to the sound of one approaching. The duty sergeant told him what he had. Stafford listened without expression. Then he stood up, took his radio off his belt, and walked out of his office. At 12:39, a separate call came into the department's administration line. It was from a legislative aide at Senator Marsh's office. At 12:41, a third call came in from the VA Secretary's press liaison, who had been looped in by Andrea Sims and had called her own superior before calling Harlow PD. 3 calls: Pentagon, Senate, VA Secretary. 23 minutes after the cuffs had gone onto Raymond Kowalski's wrists, those 3 calls were sitting in the Harlow Police Department like 3 grenades on a desk. Devon Stream, 89,000 viewers. The clip had been reposted by 2 national accounts, with a combined following of 14 million people. The comment sections were moving too fast to read. On the sidewalk, Raymond Kowalski heard the tow truck's engine rev slightly as the driver tested the hook's tension against the frame of the BBQ truck. He felt something in his chest that he did not let into his face. He looked at his truck. He thought about the brisket that was still in the smoker. It had been on since 4 that morning, and it had 3 more hours to go, and nobody had turned it off. He thought about practical things, because practical things were what you held on to when everything else was out of your hands. Then Prescott's radio crackled. It was not loud, but the midday air was clear and still, and 40 people had been silent long enough that even a low transmission carried. The voice on the radio was measured and deliberate in the way that authority sounds when it has already made a decision and is no longer asking questions. "Prescott, this is Captain Stafford." Prescott stopped pacing. "Do not move that truck." The tow truck driver froze with his hand on the hook. "I repeat, do not move that truck. Return to the precinct immediately." The sidewalk went completely silent. Not even phones shifted. Devon Park held his frame steady. Bridget Calloway lowered her personal phone from her ear and raised her camera. Darlene Kowalski unclasped her hands. Walter Pruitt exhaled for what felt like the first time in 30 minutes. And Raymond Kowalski, sitting on a warm Georgia curb in the full overhead noon light, with his wrists behind his back and his apron still smelling of brisket smoke and his eyes fully open, allowed the smallest thing to cross his face. Not a smile, not relief. Just the quiet recognition of a man who had learned a long time ago that you do not celebrate the turn in the road before you have walked through it, but you are allowed, for one private second, to know that it has come. It had come. The black and white cruiser rolled onto Delaney Street at 12:47 in the afternoon, and it wasn't a patrol unit. It was a command vehicle. White city seal on the door, no light bar running, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had already made every decision before leaving the parking lot. The crowd on the sidewalk noticed it before Prescott did. 40-some people standing in the overhead noon glare, phones still raised, paper plates abandoned on the ground, watched the car ease to the curb and park behind the 2 patrol units still blocking Kowalski's BBQ from the street. Captain Jerome Stafford stepped out. He was a broad man in his mid-50s, long-sleeved Navy uniform, pressed with the kind of precision that doesn't come from a dry cleaner. Silver captain's bars catching the flat white light of the midday sun. He wore no sunglasses, He looked at the scene in front of him with an expression so carefully controlled, it communicated everything precisely because it communicated nothing. No surprise, no warmth, no irritation, just a man absorbing information he had already been briefed on and confirming that the briefing had, in fact, understated the situation. Raymond Kowalski was still sitting on the curb. White chef's tee, black apron with the truck name across the chest, dark cargo pants, wrists cuffed behind him. He had not moved, had not spoken above a conversational tone since the cuffs went on, and his stillness, in the bright, relentless daylight, surrounded by filming strangers, had taken on a quality that was difficult to name. It wasn't resignation, it wasn't defeat. It was the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have sat in far worse places and understood that panic was a resource you could only spend once. Walter Pruitt, standing 6 feet from Raymond Kowalski and not having moved an inch in 30 minutes, watched Captain Stafford cross the sidewalk and immediately recognized the body language. He leaned over to Devon Park, whose phone was still live and still climbing. The viewer counter had blown past 60,000 while Stafford was parking, and said quietly, "Something just changed." Devon kept filming. Stafford didn't walk toward Raymond Kowalski first. He walked toward Prescott. Glenn Prescott was standing near the front bumper of the tow truck, which had been parked and waiting for the last 22 minutes while Prescott waited for a dispatcher confirmation that never came the way he wanted it to. He had the flat-footed posture of a man who had committed to a position and was now waiting for the world to catch up to him. When he saw Stafford, something shifted in his jaw, barely visible, barely there. But Bridget Calloway's camera was 16 feet away and already zoomed in, and it caught it. Stafford stopped, 12 inches from Prescott. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Walk with me." He did not say please. He did not wait for an answer. They moved to the narrow gap between the two parked patrol units. And what Stafford understood about sound and midday air and 40 people standing in perfect silence was apparently less than he needed it to be, because the crowd heard it in pieces, not the full conversation, but enough. The words arrived in fragments over the flat noon quiet. Pentagon. A pause. Senator Marsh's office. Yes, the senator himself. Called the mayor's direct line. Another pause. Longer this time. VA secretary's press liaison. Simultaneously. And then, in the clearest voice Stafford used in the entire exchange, "Distinguished Service Cross, Glenn. Do you understand what that means? Do you know what he did to get that?" Devon Park's phone caught all of it. So did 4 other live streams. So did Bridget Calloway's press recorder, which was a significantly better piece of equipment than anyone on that sidewalk would have guessed from looking at her 20 minutes earlier eating a brisket sandwich. Prescott's face went through its changes in approximately 8 seconds. The first expression was the mechanical one, the trained non-reaction of a man who spent years learning to control his face in front of supervisors. It lasted about a second and a half before something underneath it broke through and replaced it with something that might have been, in another light, confusion, genuine disorientation, the look of a man who had structured an entire morning around a certainty that was no longer certain. That lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then came something tighter, something that closed around his eyes, the expression of a man doing fast, desperate arithmetic. Then a flash of what was almost anger, redirected almost immediately inward because there was nowhere left to point it. And finally, the fifth expression, the one that settled and stayed, a kind of pale, terrible understanding. Bridget Calloway got every frame. Stafford turned and walked back toward the curb. Prescott followed 2 steps behind, and there was something in that positioning, Prescott behind, following, rather than beside, that the crowd registered immediately. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Stafford crouched down in front of Raymond Kowalski. He was a large man crouching in front of a seated man, and he did not perform it, did not make it theatrical, did not frame it for cameras. He simply lowered himself to Raymond Kowalski's level, looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Kowalski, I'm Captain Jerome Stafford. I'm sorry for what's happened here today. I'm going to remove these restraints. Can you stand?" Raymond Kowalski looked at him for one quiet moment and said, "Yes, sir." The key came from Stafford's own belt. He reached around, found the cuffs, and clicked them open with 2 practiced turns. Raymond Kowalski brought his hands forward slowly, the way you move a thing that has been held wrong for too long, and rubbed his left wrist with his right thumb once, just once, and then stopped and put both hands on his knees. He did not stand immediately. He sat there for exactly 3 more seconds in the bright overhead light. The same curbside, the same asphalt, the same 40 people filming. And he closed his eyes for those 3 seconds exactly the way he had closed them on the curb in Kandahar, with the radio crackling and the smoke still in the air. The same internal protocol, the same deliberate reset. And when he opened them, he placed one hand on the curb, one on his knee, and stood up straight. The crowd made a sound that was not quite a cheer. It was something more complicated than that, more like a collective exhale that had been held for 45 minutes, released all at once. Darlene Kowalski, who had been standing in the front row of bystanders with a grocery bag still in her left hand and both eyes fixed on her son for the last 20 minutes, put the bag down on the ground and pressed her right hand flat against her sternum and held it there. Stafford stood beside Raymond Kowalski and addressed the general space in front of him, not any particular camera, not any particular face, in the measured cadence of a man reading from a statement he had composed in his head on the drive over. "On behalf of the Harlow Police Department, I want to state clearly and for the record that the business permit issued to Kowalski's BBQ is a valid city document. This vehicle and all associated equipment will not be moved. Any suggestion that this permit was fraudulent was an error. I apologize to Mr. Kowalski and to everyone present." 2 feet to Stafford's left, Glenn Prescott stood with his hands at his sides and his short-sleeved uniform pulling slightly across his shoulders and his sunglasses still pushed up on his forehead, where he had put them 90 minutes earlier in another life. He was looking at a point somewhere above the roofline of the building across the street. He did not speak. No one asked him to. Walter Pruitt, who had served with Raymond Kowalski in 2 countries and had seen him in situations that made this sidewalk look comfortable, watched Prescott from across the concrete and felt something that was not quite satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling after a final report comes in and confirms what everyone in the unit already knew. Not pleasure, just accounting. The white city vehicle, double parked behind Stafford's cruiser, had been sitting there unnoticed for the last 40 seconds while the crowd watched the uncuffing. The door opened now, and Councilwoman Lena Vasquez stepped out in a dark blazer and charcoal slacks, moving with the particular momentum of someone who had been furious for 35 minutes and had been held up by every red light between City Hall and Delaney Street. She was holding a single sheet of paper, white, official letterhead, printed crisp, and she held it the way you hold evidence. She did not go to Stafford. She did not go to Prescott. She walked directly to the open space in front of the largest visible cluster of phones and cameras, and she turned to face them, and she spoke. "My name is Lena Vasquez. I am the Harlow City Council District 3 representative, and I personally approved and co-signed the operating permit for Kowalski's BBQ 14 months ago. This is a copy of that permit on city letterhead, bearing my signature and the city planning director's signature." She held the paper up, flat, readable, in the full overhead light. "What happened to Raymond Kowalski today on this sidewalk is an embarrassment to this city and an assault on a decorated American hero. I am calling for an immediate formal review, and I want to be absolutely clear." She paused once, deliberately. This permit was never in question. It was never forged. It was never fraudulent. It was valid the moment he was handcuffed, and every officer present knew it. She lowered the paper. She did not look at Prescott. She walked directly to Raymond Kowalski and she looked at him the way you look at someone when you need them to know that your anger is not with them and has never been with them. And she said, "Raymond, I am sorry. This should not have happened." Raymond Kowalski looked at her and nodded once. "Thank you, Councilwoman." And then there was a pause, the natural pause of a moment that has arrived at its pivot point, where the crowd was watching Raymond Kowalski, and Raymond Kowalski was the center of more cameras and more eyes than he had ever been in a room that wasn't a Pentagon ceremony. And instead of a statement, instead of a declaration, instead of anything the moment seemed to call for, Raymond Kowalski turned and looked past Stafford and past the tow truck, still idling at the curb, and he looked at his truck, the Kowalski's BBQ lettering on the side panel, the smoker still running, the serving window still open, 18 months of a recipe, 14 months of a permit, 40-some regular customers, one Thursday morning army buddy, one 19-year-old kid still holding a phone with 60,000 people watching. He looked at it the way you look at a thing that is yours. He turned back to Captain Stafford and he asked, in a tone that was fully and completely serious, "Is my truck okay?" Not what happens to Prescott, not who's going to answer for this, not what does accountability look like, not any version of the question that the moment seemed to be offering him. Just, "Is my truck okay?" Stafford blinked once. "Yes, Mr. Kowalski, your truck is fine." Raymond Kowalski nodded. He smoothed the front of his apron, black, Kowalski's BBQ in white lettering, slightly wrinkled from sitting on a curb, and he looked down the line of people who had never left. 40 customers still standing in the bright Tuesday afternoon with their phones out, and he said, to no one specifically and everyone completely, "Then let's get back to it. Devon Park, phone still live, viewer count still climbing." Turned the camera on the crowd for 1 second. 60,000 people watching faces go from tense to electric in real time, and then swung it back to Raymond Kowalski already moving toward the truck door, apron on, shoulders straight, the afternoon sun hitting the Harlow sidewalk at full, unobstructed noon angle, casting no shadows worth measuring. The timestamp on Devon Park's livestream read 1:47 p.m. when Raymond Kowalski climbed back through the service door of his truck, untied his apron from where it had been draped over the bumper by one of the officers, and retied it around his waist with the same two-loop knot he used every single morning. Outside, the Harlow afternoon sun pressed down through a cloudless sky, throwing clean white light across the sidewalk where, 47 minutes earlier, his wrists had been inside a pair of handcuffs. The concrete was still warm. The smell of brisket smoke still hung in the air because Raymond had never cut the heat. Nobody had touched his smoker. The fire was still going, and so was he. Devon Park stood 6 feet from the truck window with the phone angled up, his blue short-sleeve shirt and gray joggers damp at the collar from standing in the Georgia sun for the better part of an hour. His hands were completely steady. He had 190,000 concurrent viewers, and the number was still climbing. He didn't say a word. He just kept the camera pointed at the window and waited. The way Raymond had once told him, patience was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. Raymond's face appeared in the service window. Dark eyes, relaxed jaw, apron reading Kowalski's BBQ centered on his chest, over the white chef's tee and dark cargo pants. Same as always. Same as every Tuesday. He looked directly into the phone camera. He let 1 full second pass. Then he said it. "We're still open." The cheer that came out of that doubled crowd was not a polite clap. It was the sound of 80 people who had been holding something tightly in their chests for the last hour and suddenly releasing it all at once into a bright Tuesday sky. People who had stayed through the cuffing, through the confrontation, through Captain Stafford's arrival and Prescott's visible unraveling. They were still there, and they brought their neighbors, and those neighbors had texted their coworkers, and the sidewalk in front of Kowalski's BBQ was now thick with people standing shoulder to shoulder under the direct overhead midday sun, phones raised, paper plates appearing from nowhere, out of hope and anticipation. The cheer rolled down the block. Darlene Kowalski, standing beside Councilwoman Lena Vasquez near the front of the gathering, pressed one hand over her mouth and breathed out through her nose. She didn't cry. She had raised a man who was standing in his own truck, in his own apron, on his own permit, and she had always known it would be this way. She just never wanted him to need to prove it. Walter Pruitt was already at the smoker. Navy blue short-sleeve shirt tucked into dark work pants, pulling back the lid and checking the brisket with the easy expertise of a man who had been doing this every Thursday for 2 years without being asked. He looked over at Raymond through the window and gave one nod. Raymond gave one nod back. It was a complete conversation. They sold out in 40 minutes. 41 minutes, to be precise, because Raymond refused to rush a single order, and the 16th person in line requested extra sauce, and Raymond took the same 11 seconds he always took to shake the bottle and apply it correctly, because that was the standard, and the standard did not move because of crowd size or viral reach, or the fact that Devon Park's phone was still running and the viewer count had just crossed 300,000. Raymond Kowalski served every plate like it was the first one of the day, while he worked the window, and Walter ran the smoker, and Devon held the live stream steady. The rest of the country was doing something entirely different with the last 90 minutes. Bridget Calloway was standing 60 feet away on the same sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear and camera bag over her shoulder of her olive green blouse and black slacks, talking to her editor in a voice that was very calm and very fast. The camera crew her editor dispatched had arrived 12 minutes ago and was already capturing B-roll, the truck, the crowd, the permit that Councilwoman Vasquez was still holding, printed on official city letterhead, signed and dated and absolutely real. Bridget had been a local reporter for 9 years. She knew what a national story felt like. This one felt like standing next to a transformer when it blows, an enormous, immediate, irreversible transfer of energy. She filed her first package at 2:03 p.m. It led the 3 p.m. local broadcast on 2 affiliates before she'd even eaten the brisket she'd ordered before all of this started. By 2:15 p.m., 3 major social media platforms had the clip of Prescott dropping Raymond's permit on the asphalt. By 2:30 p.m., the clip of the dispatcher confirming the permit's validity over the radio, followed by 2 seconds of silence, followed by Prescott's voice saying it must be forged, had been viewed 1.4 million times. By 3 p.m., someone had located Raymond Kowalski's Distinguished Service Cross citation in the publicly available military records database, and it was everywhere. The citation read, in the formal language of military commendation, that Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski had on a specific date in Kandahar province, under direct enemy fire, moved twice into an exposed position to drag wounded soldiers to cover, remained in that position for 40 minutes, providing suppressive fire and administering first aid with a tourniquet fashioned from his own gear, and that his actions had directly preserved the lives of 3 men who would otherwise not have survived the engagement. It was 4 sentences long. It did not use the word hero. It did not need to. Cable news ran those 4 sentences on a lower third graphic while playing Devon Park's footage of Raymond standing on the sidewalk in handcuffs, completely still, hands open at his sides, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that was not anger and not fear and not performance. It was the expression of a man who had been in Kandahar for 40 minutes under fire and knew exactly how long 40 minutes actually was. The anchors went quiet for a moment after the citation read out on air. That silence lasted 4 seconds. It felt much longer. Every detail Prescott had been too arrogant to check was now on every screen in America. Glenn Prescott himself was in Captain Stafford's office at the precinct, his short-sleeved navy uniform shirt wrinkled from the morning, his department-issued phone sitting on Stafford's desk in a Ziploc evidence bag. The bag had been Stafford's idea, and Prescott's attorney, reached by personal cell in the parking lot outside the precinct, had told him to say nothing. Prescott was finding that instruction easier to follow than he expected, because he genuinely could not identify a single thing to say that wouldn't make everything worse. His attorney said the word exposure 3 times in the first 2 minutes of their call, and then said it 4 more times after that. The Fraternal Order of Police issued a statement at 3:22 p.m. It was 63 words long. It expressed confidence in due process, called for a full review of the facts, committed to transparency, and pledged support for officers who uphold the law with integrity. It did not contain the name Glenn Prescott. It did not contain the phrase "stand behind our officers." That omission was noticed by every reporter covering the story within 11 minutes and became its own news item by 4 p.m. At 3:45 p.m., Colonel Simone Hartley stood in front of a Pentagon press room podium under overhead fluorescent lighting that made her dress uniform look sharp as a photograph, the double row of ribbons above her left breast pocket catching the light. She was compact and precise, and she spoke for exactly 90 seconds without notes. She said that the Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative was a federally funded program under direct oversight of the VA Secretary's office, and that Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, USA retired, was the inaugural featured entrepreneur of that program. She said that the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office was monitoring the situation in Harlow, Georgia with full attention. She said that the initiative's documentary feature on Sergeant Kowalski would be accelerated and expanded. She said the program itself would be expanded. Then she looked directly into the camera, and she said the words that anchors would replay for the next 18 hours. The United States government does not forget its veterans, and neither does the American public, as today has made clear. She stepped away from the podium without taking questions. The clip ran on every network before she reached the door. At 4:12 p.m., Raymond Kowalski's phone, his personal cell, sitting on the small shelf inside the truck next to the sauce bottles, lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it because he was boxing an order. It rang again. He finished the box, set it on the counter for Walter to pass out the window, and picked up the phone. Devin Park was still outside with the live stream going. Raymond glanced at Devin. Devin glanced back. Raymond hit the green button and then hit the speaker button because the truck was his, and the window was open, and he had nothing to hide. The voice on the other end was measured and practiced. The voice of a man who had spent decades speaking for public record without quite sounding like he was. "Sergeant Kowalski, this is Senator Clifford Marsh. I want you to know I've seen what happened today, and I want you to know personally, Senator." Raymond's voice was even and warm and not unkind in any way at all. "Sir, I appreciate it. I genuinely do. But I've got brisket to finish." There was a pause on the senator's end that lasted exactly long enough to be perfect. Then Senator Marsh laughed. A real laugh, not a political one. The kind that comes out because there is simply no other available response. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. "Thank you, Senator," Raymond said, and ended the call, and picked up the tongs. Devin Park's phone captured all of it. The viewer count was at 680,000 live when it happened. The clip itself, 9 seconds. Raymond in his white tee and black apron, tongs in one hand, phone on speaker in the other, brisket to finish, was eventually watched 22 million times. People sent it to their parents. They sent it to their children. They posted it with every variation of caption that meant the same thing. "This is the man. This is exactly who you want to be when the world tries to reduce you." What none of those 22 million people could hear in the clip, because Devin's phone wasn't close enough to catch it, was what Walter Pruitt said from behind the smoker 3 seconds after Raymond hung up. He said it quietly, the way men say things they mean completely. "There he is." Raymond didn't respond. He was already working. The line was still out the door, and the afternoon sun was still overhead, and the truck was still running, and the smoke from the mesquite was still rising straight up into the clean blue air above Harlow, Georgia, visible from 2 blocks away if you knew where to look, which anyone who had eaten there on a Tuesday afternoon already did. The crowd didn't leave until the last order was called. When Raymond slid the service window closed, Darlene Kowalski was standing at the front of the empty sidewalk with a paper plate and a full portion and a look on her face that was not pride exactly and not relief exactly. It was recognition. She looked at the truck and she saw the man she had raised standing inside it, and everything that had been taken from him in 20 minutes had been returned, and then some, and the afternoon was still bright, and the smoke was still rising, and her son was still standing. She took a bite of the brisket. She nodded once. Still perfect. 3 days after a Tuesday afternoon changed everything in Harlow, Georgia. The sun came up the same way it always did. Bright, indifferent, flooding the city through every window and skylight without asking permission. The Internal Affairs Division of the Harlow Police Department occupied the 3rd floor of the municipal building on Crestwood Avenue, a floor most officers spent entire careers never visiting. On this particular Friday morning, 3 investigators were already at their desks before 7, fluorescent overhead lights humming steadily above them, a stack of files growing taller by the hour. At the center of that stack was a name, Officer Glenn Prescott, badge number 1142, 11 years on the force, and as of 72 hours ago, the most documented failure of professional conduct in the department's history. The body camera footage was supposed to be gone. Prescott had told his supervisor, in a written statement submitted the evening of the incident, that both cameras, his and his secondary officers, had experienced simultaneous technical failures. Simultaneous, as if lightning had struck twice in the same uniform pocket. The IA investigators had heard creative explanations before, but that one earned a quiet, humorless look between 2 senior detectives before anyone spoke. The department's IT division pulled the cloud backup archive within 24 hours of receiving the order, and what they found there was not a malfunction. What they found was a timestamp at 12:03 p.m. on Tuesday, 47 seconds before Prescott's patrol car came to a stop in front of Kowalski's BBQ. Prescott's body camera had been manually switched off, not disrupted, not shorted out, switched off, deliberately. The secondary officer's footage remained intact and captured everything from a different angle. The theatrical drop of the permit onto the asphalt, the crowd frozen under the noon light, Raymond Kowalski standing with his hands open, and Prescott's own words delivered loud enough that the microphone had no trouble catching them at all. Under the Harlow Police Department's use of force and conduct policy, deliberately deactivating a body camera prior to a civilian interaction was classified as a Category 1 terminable offense, not suspendable, terminable. The investigators noted that in their report with the careful neutral language of people who understood exactly what they were writing and why every word of it mattered. They did not editorialize, they did not need to. The timestamp did that for them. The second discovery took longer, but hit harder. A compliance review of Prescott's 11-year record, ordered as standard procedure in any IA investigation of this magnitude, surfaced 2 prior complaints that had been filed by fellow officers, not civilians, but officers, alleging racially motivated conduct during civilian stops. Both complaints had been submitted during the tenure of the previous precinct captain, a man who had retired 18 months ago, with a commendation dinner and a framed photo with the mayor. Both complaints had been logged, reviewed, and closed without investigation. Not dismissed for lack of evidence. Closed. The distinction, as the city attorney explained to the mayor in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes before the mayor ended it by standing up, was legally catastrophic. The city had documented knowledge of a pattern and had chosen, through its own administrative process, to ignore it. That was not a mistake that creative lawyering could make disappear. That was liability with a paper trail. The city attorney's advice was delivered the same afternoon and contained exactly 4 words that the mayor remembered above everything else. Settle quickly. settle quietly. The quietly part was already lost. Nothing about Raymond Kowalski's situation was quiet anymore. Raymond Kowalski arrived at the office of attorney Simone Adeze Okafor on Friday morning at 9 o'clock, wearing a clean white Henley, dark cargo pants, and the same unhurried expression he had worn on the sidewalk 3 days before. Darlene Kowalski walked in beside him in a steel blue blouse and dark slacks, her reading glasses already on, a small notepad tucked under her arm. She had been a schoolteacher for 31 years. She came to every important meeting the same way she had once walked into parent conferences, calm, prepared, and completely unwilling to be dismissed. Walter Pruitt had offered to drive them. Raymond had told him to open the truck. The line wasn't going to serve itself. Attorney Okafor's office occupied the 7th floor of a building on Harlow's east side, where the morning light came in hard through floor-to-ceiling windows, laying bright rectangular panels across the conference table. She had been referred by Raymond's Army JAG contact, a woman who had spent 8 years defending soldiers' legal rights, and who, upon hearing the details of Tuesday's incident, had called Okafor before she even called Raymond back. Okafor was 43, wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, and had spent the last decade specializing in civil rights litigation. She had reviewed the footage before Raymond sat down. She laid out the claims with the directness of someone who respected her client enough not to soften what was already good news. The federal program connection created a dimension most civil rights cases never had, an institutional thread running directly from the sidewalk in Harlow to the Pentagon, establishing that the harm done was not merely personal, but had implicated a federally protected initiative and the veterans it was designed to serve. The documented racial statements, captured on multiple cameras including Bridget Calloway's professional-grade press footage, established intentional discriminatory conduct. The malicious impound attempt, an effort to seize lawfully permitted property without cause, constituted an abuse of authority with financial damages attached. And the body camera deactivation, Okafor noted, pausing to let the weight of it land, demonstrated premeditation. Prescott had not acted in the heat of the moment. He had switched off his camera before he even got out of the car. Raymond listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. He asked whether his truck had sustained any damage during the attempted impound. Okafor confirmed it had not. Raymond nodded and said they could proceed. Then Darlene Kowalski looked up from her notepad and asked her question. She asked it the way she had once asked questions in faculty meetings, when the answer everyone was dancing around needed to be named directly. She did not raise her voice. She did not frame it as an accusation. She simply asked, "What happens to the officers who filed those earlier complaints? The ones who saw something wrong and put it in writing, and were then watched while the department buried what they said?" The room was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Okafor set down her pen. She said that was the right question. She said it was, in fact, the question that transformed this case from a single incident of misconduct into a systemic accountability matter, and that the officers who had filed those complaints and been ignored may have their own legal standing, their own stories that had been waiting for exactly this moment to become visible. She said Darlene's question was going to need to be answered publicly, and that once it was asked in the right room by the right people, it would not be easy for anyone to unask it. By Friday afternoon, Bridget Calloway had the story. She did not get it from Okafor's office, which maintained appropriate client confidentiality. She got it the way good reporters always get things, by asking the right people the right questions in the right order, until a door opened. Her segment led the 6 o'clock local news and was picked up nationally within the hour. The graphic behind her read, "2 prior complaints, both closed, no investigation." The second news cycle, which Raymond Kowalski himself had not sought and did not orchestrate, had begun without him. Darlene's question was now the question every journalist in the state was trying to answer, and the 2 officers who had filed those complaints, one currently serving, one retired, were already being contacted by attorneys they had not known to call before. Tuesday changed the temperature of everything. Walter Pruitt sat down for his fourth media interview of the week on Friday evening, this time with a national outlet that had sent a correspondent to Harlow specifically to find him. He was in his usual Thursday work clothes because, as he explained without apology, he had come straight from the truck. He wore a faded olive green t-shirt and dark jeans, and had the particular posture of a man who has spent enough years standing at attention that relaxed still looks disciplined. The correspondent asked him to describe what he had seen on Tuesday when the cuffs went on Raymond Kowalski. Walter Pruitt did not hesitate. He said Raymond had gone still, in a way that only made sense if you had seen it before. Not frozen, not scared, still. The kind of still that costs something to hold on to when everything around you is chaos. He said in Kandahar, before a patrol, Raymond used to close his eyes for 3 seconds and then open them and be ready. Not ready like resigned, but ready like prepared, like he had already made his peace with whatever was coming and was just waiting for it to catch up. He said that on the sidewalk, in the noon sun, in front of 40 people with their phones up, he watched Raymond do the exact same thing, close his eyes, open them, be present. Walter Pruitt said, he knew, he stayed ready. That's just who he is. The correspondent asked if Raymond had known the calls were coming. The Pentagon, the senator, the captain's radio crackling. Walter shook his head. He said Raymond hadn't known anything specific. He said that wasn't the point. The point was that Raymond had done what Raymond always did. He had stood in the hardest moment he was handed and refused to become anything smaller than himself inside it, whether the system came through or not. That was the part Walter said he needed people to understand, because he had watched too many people reduce Tuesday to a story about how the phone calls saved Raymond. The phone calls didn't save Raymond. Raymond had already saved himself the moment he chose not to become what Prescott was trying to make him. That quote, "He stayed ready," ran in 47 publications by Saturday morning. It ran under photos of Raymond at the truck window, at the Pentagon ceremony years earlier, and in one case, alongside a still from Devon Park's live stream, Raymond Kowalski sitting cuffed on a sun-bright sidewalk in his white chef's tee and black apron, back straight, eyes open, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused calm of a man who has seen worse and survived it with his dignity not just intact, but sharpened. The IA investigation continued. The city attorney continued drafting settlement language. The 2 officers who had filed the prior complaints continued receiving phone calls they were now ready to return. And in the municipal building on Crestwood Avenue, under the steady hum of overhead fluorescent lights, a file with Prescott's name on it grew heavier with every hour, weighted by timestamps and transcripts and the documented shape of a pattern that had been visible for years to anyone willing to look directly at it. Raymond Kowalski was not in any of those rooms. He was on Clement Street, where the line for brisket now stretched half a block every single day, where Devon Park was simultaneously taking orders and managing a social media presence that had acquired a life of its own, where the midday sun came straight down through an open blue sky and made everything on that sidewalk exactly as bright and clear as it had been on Tuesday. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, and every person who walked up to that window knew it. 6 weeks. That is how long it took for the world to finish rearranging itself around one Tuesday afternoon on a Harlow, Georgia sidewalk. 6 weeks for the paperwork to catch up to the truth. 6 weeks for the system, slow, grinding, imperfect, to look at what happened in full midday light and call it exactly what it was. Officer Glenn Prescott was terminated on a Thursday morning. No ceremony, no press conference. He cleared his locker under the watch of a union representative and a department administrator, and he walked out of the Harlow Police Department through a side door into ordinary daylight. His appeal, filed 11 days later, was reviewed by a 3-member board that had already seen the body camera footage. The footage he claimed had malfunctioned. The footage recovered intact from cloud backup, showing the exact moment he reached down and switched off the recording before he ever approached the truck. The appeal was denied in 4 pages. The board did not use the word malice. They did not need to. The 4 pages said everything that needed saying. Raymond Kowalski was not in the room when the decision came through. He was at the truck. The civil settlement was reached quietly, handled between attorneys, the city, and a federal civil rights division that had opened a parallel inquiry the same week the body camera footage surfaced. Raymond Kowalski's attorney, the one his Army JAG contact had referred, the one who had sat across from Darlene Kowalski and watched an elegant 62-year-old retired schoolteacher ask a single question that launched a second news cycle, described the settlement figure as appropriate without elaborating further. Raymond Kowalski took his portion, covered the legal costs, and then did something that nobody in his attorney's office had ever seen a client do in the first meeting after a settlement. He asked how to set up a nonprofit. Within 10 days, the Veterans Small Business Legal Defense Fund was established in Harlow, Georgia, seeded by a portion of Raymond Kowalski's settlement, structured to provide free legal representation to veteran entrepreneurs facing municipal or regulatory harassment. The fund received its first outside donation 40 minutes after the announcement was posted online. Within a week, it had received contributions from all 50 states. Devin Park filmed the announcement. Of course he did. The Veterans Entrepreneurship Initiative documentary, which had been quietly in production for months before any of this happened, which Raymond Kowalski had never mentioned to anyone in Harlow because he was embarrassed by the attention, was fast-tracked by the streaming platform after the incident. Colonel Simone Hartley had described the acceleration as a matter of public interest, and the platform had agreed without negotiation. Raymond Kowalski's episode ran 47 minutes. It opened with archival footage from his Distinguished Service Cross ceremony, a 4-star general pressing his hand, then cut forward to him standing at a prep counter inside the truck at 5 in the morning, wearing his white chef's tee and dark cargo pants, doing exactly what he had always done. The episode drove the highest opening viewership in the program's history. Not the highest for a veteran's story, the highest, period. Raymond Kowalski watched it once, at his kitchen table, with Darlene sitting next to him. She held his hand for the last 10 minutes. He did not say anything when it finished. He stood up, rinsed his coffee mug, and went to bed because he had to be at the truck by 4:30. Congress moved faster than anyone expected. The incident had exposed a specific gap. No federal statute explicitly protected veteran-owned federally enrolled businesses from local permit interference, and no enforcement mechanism existed when a municipal officer actively violated a valid federal program participant's operating rights. Senator Clifford Marsh had been co-sponsoring legislation in the general neighborhood of that gap for 2 years. After one Tuesday in Harlow, Georgia, he had the votes. The Veterans Business Protection Act was signed into law on a bright Wednesday afternoon in the White House Rose Garden. Senator Clifford Marsh stood at the podium. Councilwoman Lena Vasquez stood 2 steps behind him, wearing a burgundy blazer and a composed expression that did not quite conceal how much the moment meant to her. Pentagon officials were present. VA secretary staff were present. Camera crews from 17 outlets were present. Raymond Kowalski stood behind the President of the United States, wearing his white chef's tee and dark cargo pants. No suit, no apron, no medals, though he had been asked if he wanted to wear them. Just himself, the way he had always been, the way he had stood on a sidewalk 6 weeks ago, when the cuffs went on and the crowd watched, and Devin Park went live, and the world began paying attention. The president shook his hand and said something quiet that the cameras did not catch. Raymond Kowalski nodded once. The next morning, Kowalski's BBQ was parked on the south lawn of the White House for a veterans event hosted by the VA's Entrepreneurship Office. The sky was clear, and the afternoon sun came straight down through open air, flooding the lawn in warm, clean light. Raymond Kowalski stood at his service window in his white chef's tee and dark cargo pants, and handed brisket plates to 36 veterans and their families, one after another, the same motion he had made 10,000 times on a Harlow sidewalk. Darlene Kowalski stood in line. She waited her turn. When she reached the window, Raymond handed her a plate, and she accepted it with a paper napkin and a look that carried 30 years of everything she had ever wanted for him. She did not say anything. She found a table in the afternoon sun, and she sat down and she ate. Walter Pruitt was working the smoker. He had driven up from Harlow the day before, same way he drove to the truck every Thursday. Nobody had to ask him. He just showed up, because that is who Walter Pruitt was, and that is who Raymond Kowalski had always known him to be. Devon Park was filming. The final chapter of this story does not happen at the White House. It happens the following Tuesday, 11 o'clock in the morning, Harlow, Georgia. The same block, the same sidewalk, the same stretch of concrete where 40 customers once stood with paper plates and watched a man be put in handcuffs for the crime of building something real. Kowalski's BBQ is parked in its spot. The overhead midday sun falls straight and clean across the truck's painted lettering, across the folding table with the sauce bottles lined up in order, across the line of people that stretches half a block down the sidewalk, longer than it has ever been, longer than any Tuesday before it. Raymond Kowalski leans out the service window and hands a customer their order. Pulled pork sandwich, extra sauce, the way they always take it. He thanks them. He looks up. He looks down the line. The faces he knows, the faces he is still learning, the people who drove 40 minutes because they saw a clip on their phone and wanted to be here, in this place, at this truck, on this sidewalk. His expression is not triumph. It is not relief. It is not the face of a man who won. It is the face of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he was built to do, in the full, unobstructed light of a Tuesday that belongs entirely to him. Kowalski's BBQ is still open. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.